Bennett said the certainty of punishment for users and dealers is more important than the severity.
He put a bullet into his smiling head.
Our most serious problem today is cocaine, and in particular, crack. Who's responsible? Let me tell you straight out. Everyone who uses drugs. Everyone who sells drugs. This is crack cocaine, seized a few days ago by drug enforcement agents in a park just across the street from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or PCP. It's as innocent looking as candy, but it's turning our cities into battle zones, and it's murdering our children. Let there be no mistake, this stuff is poison. Some used to call drugs harmless recreation. They're not.
Let's take a look at what the real problem is. It's not just how many people are using drugs. As the president said, the number of people using drugs, cocaine in particular, is down in our country. That's true. But the violence associated with drugs is spewing out all over America, and that's terrible. I know it's hard to believe, but this very day, violent drug offenders will commit more than 100,000 crimes on this day alone. And the sad part is that we have no more police in the streets of our major cities than we had 10 years ago. And what the president proposes won't help much. What he proposes is no increase over what the Congress has already approved last year. In a nutshell, the president's plan doesn't include enough police officers to catch the violent thugs, not enough prosecutors to convict them, not enough judges to sentence them, and not enough prison cells to put them away for a long time. That's why right now, 6 out of every 10 criminals who are arrested on drug charges have their cases dropped. That's why we think the president should triple the commitment that he's made tonight for police, prosecutors, and judges for our cities and our states. Second, education. The president says he's increasing money for drug education because he knows what we know. It works. We found out that when students understand how harmful cocaine is, they're 5 times less likely to even try the drug. And right now, the drug education message is reaching only 50% of the children in this country. And the President's plan, for all the talk, will only increase our efforts by 5%. You know, drug education is the only vaccine we have against the drug abuse among our young. And can you imagine me sitting before you and saying, we're only going to vaccinate 50% of the children against polio or smallpox? We have to do more. We have to educate our children about the dangers of drugs. We have to start in kindergarten, because we know that last year, 1 out of every 4 high school students in America tried drugs, and that the other 3 were prime targets of drug pushers. We can't afford to lose a generation while we're sorting out the budgetary priorities of this nation. We must do more, and now.
Your stories make me think that there's a lot more involved in solving the drug problem than just saying no, as Nancy Reagan would have it, or just lock them up and throw them in jail.
Or send them to boot camp like they're talking about.
Yeah, shock incarceration camps, locking people up. Actually, lock them up fever is really sweeping the country right now. They're talking about locking up drug users, not just dealers, but drug users.
Even the casual users.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, we already have, most people are probably not aware of it, we already have more people in highest percentage of people of our population in lockup than in any other country in the world other than South Africa.
And there are some southern states, I think 3 or 4 southern states, that have a higher per capita lockup rate than South Africa.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. So our jails are already full, and we know in places like New York you're spending $50,000 to keep a person in jail, and yet we will not spend the money necessary to have good daycare systems, good family therapy. You talk about therapy, Doug. I'll talk to you about just drug treatment. I get people every day who come to me and say, I'm ready to give it up. I had enough. Help me. And you know, in this country we have drug treatment, but it's a class system. There are over 5,000 treatment centers in the United States that are private treatment centers that cost anywhere from $500 to $1,000 a day. Now, you got to be well heeled, or you better have a major medical wraparound insurance to be able to afford those treatment centers. That excludes people on Medicaid, or worse, the 37 million Americans who are working Americans who cannot afford to have private health insurance and are not eligible for Medicaid. They're locked out of our treatment centers.
I'm one.
And you're locked out. I'm not. Well, fortunately, you don't have a drug problem. At least that you're owning up to, Frank. But so really, I get people all the time who want help, and I have to tell them if they have Medicaid, well, I'm going to have to put you on a waiting list for 2 to 3 months to get you into a long-term residential treatment.
It might be too late for...
Oh, listen, somebody's using drugs. They're ready. They're ripe. They're coming in. You put them back on the street. If they're, first of all, using needles, you got a chance they're going to share a needle with somebody. They're going to give it to their spouse. They're going to give it to a baby. The ripple effect is tremendous. We need to be giving people treatment on demand. In the end, it will even be a cost saver. But the problem in our country is that why would we give poor addicts help when we're not willing to give the poor help? I mean, Reagan was always talking about giving the deserving poor government spending. Well, everybody in our society does not see addicts as deserving poor. Most people think of addiction and drug use as a self-inflicted wound. They have only themselves to believe. I mean, I have a close relative, an in-law, who tells me she herself is the child of an alcoholic. Her father ran away from a large family when she was a small child. But she'll tell me, she said, you know, Jack, I just don't buy your argument about these addicts. You know, you're just always crying a blue streak about these addicts. I got no sympathy for them. Everybody in life has crosses to bear. You don't have to use drugs. And then I think that's the position. Most people believe that if you want to give up drugs, it's just a matter of true grit. It's just a matter of, you know, pulling up those emotional bootstraps and getting to it. And I think it's a lot more deeper than that, and we need to be providing help and services, and we as a country are particularly hard-hearted when it comes to drugs. I'll give you an example. We're about to spend $8.8 billion in the war on drugs. 70% of that is for law enforcement. Only 30% of it is for prevention and treatment.
And even that, a lot of it will go to bureaucracies or to programs that are ineffective and not down to the streets to really help the people that are suffering.
I work in a drug treatment agency, and I can tell you drug treatment is important, but I'll also tell you that focusing on treatment is in fact closing the barn door after the horse is gone. We need to be thinking about effective prevention, and effective prevention is to be looking at what is the dynamics in the society which is producing so much distress that people feel the need to use drugs in the first place. One of the things I did not talk about is that when we talk about drugs, we're not aware of that a lot of people who use drugs are in one way mentally ill. A psychiatrist in Yale did a survey a few years ago of 750 addicts. In that 750 addicts, they found that 85% of them were either schizophrenics, borderline schizophrenics, manic depressives, or they suffered heavy depressive disorders. They were or had panic disorders or anxiety disorders. So in many ways, they're taking up substances was an attempt to self-medicate their symptoms, because we don't really have a way for these people to deal with their problems. We don't have therapy. Therapy is really a rich man's sport in this country. You go out and you try to get a therapist outside of the University of Texas, where you might be able to get one at the student union, the hospital there, and you're not going to be able to afford it. It's $50, $60, $80, $90 a throw. And to good therapy, you can't just go once a week. You got to go 2-3 times a week. Who can afford that? So it's a class-bound treatment center we have, and we're also not looking at the root causes of the addiction in the first place.
Well, that it seems from what you're saying that there are basically 3 reasons because people take drugs. One is for excitement, like you say, another is for escape, and the third is to lessen emotional pain. You flip those upside down and say this spotlights a total societal disorder, where why do people need excitement? Are most of everybody's lives boring? Is their work life boring? Is their family life boring? And what are they escaping from? Why do they need escape? And then the pain. What causes the pain that people are trying to escape?
Well, Frank, you old radical, you. I mean, that's exactly the thing. What we talked about before is that, in fact, drugs in some measure meet legitimate needs that people have. You know, we talk about this. You know, you listen to people like Bill Bennett say, well, this is a hedonistic society. This is a pleasure-oriented society. This is a do-your-own-thing society. Frankly, this is a society which, in fact, has its nose to the grindstone. We now have families where there has to be 2 paychecks. Everybody's out working. Everybody is goal-oriented. It's, you know, like the commercial says, where it absolutely positively has to be there overnight. This is a production-oriented society. Very work, work, work. I mean, where we get pleasure, actually we get pleasure in the form of commodities. Commodities in the form of food, in the forms of things that are part of our passive spectator culture. And why are we passive? Most of us come home dead beat, our ass dragging from a day's work. And about the only energy we have left is to put ourselves into the easy chair, put our feet up on the hassock, get the remote control, and sit in front of the boob tube glued and take that in. That's pleasure? I don't think that's pleasure, by no means.
With beer or
with
drinks,
a beer, or with
right,
food, or with some other means to distract ourselves. We're not a society that is all encourages pleasure. I think we're, in fact, a society that still has a good deal of a Puritan ethic, or in my sense, I'm raised Catholic, and there was always a lot of guilt about feeling good as being Catholic. You're not allowed, you're supposed not to feel good.
Jack, it sounds to me like we're talking about perestroika in the USA, that we need a lot of social restructuring and social change in our society. We need a new set of values, a new set of social institutions, social relations, that it's really this competitive stress society, this social Darwinism that's the survival of the fittest, where if you don't make it, there's really no institutions, no safety net, no help to take care of you. It's this individualism gone berserk and amok. in our society that's really at the bottom of this drug problem, and if we don't start changing our attitude towards values, towards work, towards everything, as well as our institutions, we're not going to really be able to deal with this drug problem. To begin dealing with the drug problem, we need to talk about new drug treatment programs. We need to have programs out there that will help addicts get off the street, that will help people deal with drug problems. That, to me, it sounds like this also involves psychiatric treatment, counseling, as well as just simply programs like methadone or whatever, education to get people off of drugs.
Well, clearly, if you see drugs as symptomatic, then you look what the problem is. And for me, the problem is, one, it's very easy to get somebody off of drugs. You just put them in a 5-day detox or a 10-day detox, and their body is now clean of the drug.
But that's merely a medical treatment.
That's only a medical treatment, and in fact is only dealing at a symptomatic level. When you put them back in an environment where they don't have opportunity, or an environment where they have lots of stress, or an environment which where they have not been able to address a lot of the underlying emotional difficulties they have, then they're going to relapse, they're going to go back. And so you have to begin thinking about this issue in a much more holistic kind of way, in a much more totalistic kind of way than you find policymakers in Washington with very easy sloganeerings about the war on drugs.
You're going to need to rebuild the cities, it seems to me, that the drug cultures are precisely that. It's whole urban ghettos, whole subcultures where there's nothing but drug use everywhere you look. Until you eliminate these drug subcultures, you're going to have literally millions of people.
This is the problem of the part of the this is the problem of the part of the underclass. You see, it's that phrase that's developed in the last 10 years. It used to be, from a class perspective, you had the ruling class, and then you had the working class. And then the American sociology didn't like the concept of a ruling class, so they developed there's an elites, and then there's the middle class, and that's basically all of us are middle class. But the fact is, we now have a group of people who are locked in going nowhere. Millions of people who are going nowhere,
or in ghettos,
and really have their life prospects are very dim. And as a political system, we've given up on these people. I mean, the conservatives never really had much hope for them. Edward Banfield, a conservative urbanologist, said years ago that we should think of the city as a sandbox. Mm-hmm. Basically, let's write the cities off. Let's understand that they're basically decadent, and we have nothing we can do for these people. They're hopelessly, pathologically degenerate anyway.
Yes, he said to kind of cordon off the cities, to keep the people in, and then pour toys, like a sandbox, toys, i.e. drugs and things like this, into the cities, keep the people spaced out or occupied, and don't let them out. Mm-hmm. And that way, they wouldn't infect the rest of the society, and you wouldn't have to do anything more about it. It looks like this is kind of what has happened.
Well, you know, the worst part of it is, Frank, is that it's not just the conservatives. Beginning around the mid-1970s with Jimmy Carter, when he began talking about a government of limits, a government where we'd have to lower our expectations, he began saying things like, you cannot expect government to solve our problems. There began a sort of neoliberalism, a sort of fiscal conservatism on the part of liberals that said, listen, we'd love to solve all the problems in the world, but we can't throw money at every problem. And so even liberals, there's no consensus today, as at least we gave lip service to during the Johnson administration of the Great Society, to addressing these problems. We've basically written these people off, and we've written them off at a time when they cannot help themselves, because one of the issues that no one addresses is a lot of this underclass of people have been rendered technologically obsolete. Their labor is now redundant. The kind of work that my Irish grandfather did when he came from Europe in the turn of the century was to go down to the docks on the west side of New York and to do what they used to call donkey labor, and you always had the Irish to do donkey labor. And he, with the sweat of his brow and his back, built himself some kind of a life. Today, that job doesn't exist for people. It's been replaced. Those kind of manufacturing and hard labor jobs have been replaced by machinery or have been sent abroad to cheap labor markets. you now have a core of 20 to 25% of the population who literally have no meaningful, well-paying work for. The only thing they have, only prospects they have in front of them is flipping burgers at Wendy's.
Which you can't live on those salaries.
You can't live on those salaries, and then one of the reasons why we're talking about drugs and why people use drugs, but there's a political economy of drugs. Today in New York City, there are sections of New York City that are coming back to life because why? Because the drug money that's infusing a renaissance. Parts of East New York and Queens, where the Jamaicans and the rest of the drug gangs are pouring that money back into the community. Actually, Nixon and the Republicans finally got black capitalism, but now it's in the form of the drug economy.
On the other hand, there's other whole parts of the city that are just destroyed.
Yes.
Where the crime, the crack houses, it makes it impossible as a living habitat, and impossible to escape that drug culture unless you literally leave it.
And how can you leave it? Now, who has the dollars to leave it? I know a lot of the blacks that I treat as a drug counselor are making a decision to leave and go back south. That's about the only thing. Some of them have relatives down there.
Which is a curious reversal of the earlier patterns.
Exactly. They came north for opportunity, and now they go back for opportunity to live, because New York City and the other urban ghettos just are really uninhabitable at this point. We've been talking about a lot of things. We don't talk about even the crime, what it's like to live in these war zones where innocent people are getting wiped out in these gang wars, these turf wars that are happening in these cities.
Teenage death rates are just incredible. I've read several articles in the Times about this. Jack, one thing we haven't talked about here is the issue of drugs and social control. It seems that obviously that once a certain labor force is obsolete technologically, the society doesn't really care about them. So drugs become a method of social control to keep the underclass down, to keep pacified a potentially restive force. In the 1960s, it was precisely in the urban ghettos that you had blacks, Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, people of all different races and origins who were a radical political force. You don't see this anymore. The drug culture has destroyed the radical political subculture that makes one think that they may be people, different groups in this society, may be using drugs as instruments of social control.
Well, you're not the first to bring that up. In fact, Malcolm X, black Muslim leader, I saw a tape just recently of him saying that in 1964, just before he was assassinated in '65, where he was saying that, we don't own the planes. It's Whitey that's bringing this in. It's a way for us to be chilled out. It's a way for us to be pacified. It's a way for our people to be narcotized. I mean, I don't know if there's any conscious cabal, conspiratorial clique at the top that is sort of crafty enough to divine this pretty malevolent technique of social control. But it's certainly, whether or not it's by design, it certainly works out that way.
And a lot of people I've read and talked to people who say that during the urban riots of the 60s and 70s, that suddenly there was an enormous infusion of drugs from the outside to cool them off. Now that had to be something that was planned and controlled.
No, you know what I think it is, Frank? I don't see it as that. I think that there's so much money at stake when it comes to drugs that, I mean, just think back to Serpico, the example of Serpico, the cop in New York, tried to be an honest cop, right? There's so much drug money floating around at the end of the 60s and the 70s, is that basically everybody can get bought off. Everybody can get a piece of the action. So it may look, in fact, that everyone is approving of it, and that at the top is basically calling the shots, the people at the top calling the shots. But it really is that there's so much money that almost nobody is immune to being bought off and bribed. And so it looks like, well, the whole community is getting infested. Who's there to do the job? Who's there to stop it from coming in? The police can be bought. These kind of dollars they're talking about are a lot of money.
But Jack, the facts of the matter are that, one, it's been tolerated for several decades. Heavy drug use in the ghettos and other parts of the United States have been tolerated despite the war on drugs that Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and other right-wingers have declared. They really haven't done anything. Okay, they haven't.
What would you like them to do?
Well, let's talk about this.
No, what would you have liked them to do? Would you like them to start locking people up Nixon done that 20 years ago?
The point is they haven't done the things that we're talking about to get at the origin of the drug problem.
Why they don't see
poverty,
that as a,
ghetto life, etc.
They have a different ideology. They have different stakes. They have a different agenda. They have privilege to protect. They have their power to protect. There's all ideologies built into America that if you can make it, you can make it on your own. Even if you come up in the lowest of circumstances through hard work and ambition, you can rise up by your own bootstraps. I mean, this is not a culture that sort of looks out for the weak. This is not a culture that sheds too many tears about the poor. I mean, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that they're not looking into arrangements, social arrangements, which they see as part of nature. I mean, they don't think that this is class oppression. They think this is life. Yeah, in life there's winners and there's losers. We're sorry, but some people have to lose. That's capitalism.
But I think it's important to see that really the war on drugs as declared by Bush and all of the right-wing solutions to the drug problems are just simply pseudo-solutions that really can't work and don't work. Let's take the project of getting drugs at the source. We hear a lot about the Colombia cocaine cartel. We talk about using U.S. troops to go down to Colombia and South America and destroy drugs at the source. Why do you think this is a pseudo-solution to it and really sort of a smokescreen over the whole
Did you read my mind? You thought you knew it was a pseudo-solution? How do you know that I don't think it's a terrific idea?
Well, because we talked about this before, for one thing.
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't think it's much of a solution. I think, in fact, there's a tendency in the part of American culture to always look for outside agitators to blame. Yeah. Always look for to externalize the problem. Think of some bad apples in the barrel. In other words, American system is basically a good barrel. We've got a few bad apples, and if we can get rid of the bad apples, we've got a basically good institutional arrangements here. So it's easy to blame, the drug cartel and General Noriega and the Contras and cocaine production. Just as we blame the Turks, Nixon blamed the Turks in Turkey for the heroin production, or the Cambodians and the Laotians and the Thais for the Golden Triangle production back in the 60s and 70s. Frankly, I think really it's diversionary. Because 5 years from now, maybe even 2 years from now, we will not be talking about cocaine. Cocaine will be passé. Like good old American know-how and technology, we are now replacing natural products with synthetic products. The markets of the drugs of the future are going to be synthetic, man-made, made in clandestine secret laboratories by high school chemists are going to be able to make money. I see it now as drugs like ice and ecstasy and crank. These are all synthetic drugs, much more powerful and in many ways much more deadly than the natural products. So, and again, my argument is, why be focusing on Noriega and the Contras and the drug cartels? The reality is what is it about American culture that leaves us so ripe to want to use drugs?
I think there's a very important factor here, and that is that you were talking about Reagan and Bush and the right-wingers, well, even Jimmy Carter. This is very important for them to keep this drug thing going. As the big study group out in California a few years ago with the police from all over the country, they said, hey, we don't want to eliminate crime because then we'd be out of a job. So we got to keep enough of this going to keep our, just like the vice squads. They don't want to eliminate vice in town. They wouldn't have anything to do. They'd be out of a job. So you got to keep it going. But the people, the Reagans and the Bushes of the world, they want to use this so-called war on drugs. They don't want to stop it. Bush was in charge of interdiction of drugs, spent billions of dollars during the Reagan administration, and drug importation has only increased. But you know what you see? They're using the drug war on drugs to curtail civil liberties of ordinary people, or maybe just casual users. They also are using it as a method of mucking around in the third world. I noticed that the president of Colombia, when the Americans sent different types of military armaments down there to fight against the Colombian drug cartels, he said, hey, wait a minute. This isn't the type of equipment we need to fight the drug cartels, but it's perfect if you want to use it against the left-wing insurgent guerrillas. And the same thing I noticed in Peru and Bolivia. When the Americans go down there, advisors, they're down there under the, supposedly, to fight drugs. But what are they doing? They're not fighting the drug lords and all. They're after the left-wing guerrillas who are trying to overthrow the governments, who won't say no.
Well, that's the thing.
So there are a lot of agendas and excuses that they've got to keep this drug war going.
Well, that's the thing I like about alternative views. Never ask leading questions on this show.
Jack, I have another leading question for you. A lot of the liberals and libertarians, in response to this right-wing war on drugs, that they see as repressive of our civil liberties and as extending an interventionist foreign policy, they say, hey, let's just legalize it. We'll get rid of organized crime and the criminalization of drugs. We can solve the prison problem. There's tons of people in prison that cost, as you said earlier, $50,000 a day for the state to take care of. Why don't we just decriminalize drugs? If some people want to destroy themselves, okay. We can use some of the money from the profits from drugs for rehabilitation programs for other people that want to get off drugs. What's wrong with this libertarian legalization argument?
They also say that the price will go down on drugs, and therefore that the addicts, the people who use them, won't have to go on Mother's Day beat up on the ladies and little old ladies who are getting their welfare checks or their Social Security checks. They won't have to prostitute themselves in order to get money because the price will be low.
So all the problems of drugs will be solved by legalization, right?
No, I think what you'll solve with legalization, and on the face of it, it's a fairly attractive and it's a very tightly reasoned article, thesis. I think what you'll do is you'll probably have a decrease in property crimes, which, of course, if you have property, is always people are interested in doing. If you have property, and Milton Friedman and William F. Buckley and a number of conservatives have put this forward as a means to deal with the drug problem. They're not talking about the drug problem. They're really talking about the crime problem.
Well, actually, not property. I mean, people getting mugged in the streets.
Well, yes. Well, that's the way.
Bodies of people's property.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the cover. I think that's the cover story. I really think that these, from a practical standpoint, legalization is a complete mess. Let me just pose it to you. We have laws now in this country in every state that says if you're a bartender, you cannot serve an inebriated or an intoxicated person. In fact, in places like New York, you have liquor law liability, which says if you serve an intoxicated person that last drink, and that person goes out and has an accident, you are responsible for the damages. You can be sued. Now, I would ask you, if we were to have state-supported drug clinics, actually state-supported crack houses, and somebody came in and wanted to get high, at what point would you tell them that they had enough? Listen, fella, you've had enough. You can't have any more. Do you know what it's like to tell somebody who's been using cocaine or crack, you've had enough and you're not going to have any more? First of all, you're going to have cops right in there to restrain this person when he goes nuts and says, I want more, you're not going to stop me. But let's say that he has, and you'll give him an hour's worth of drugs, or 2 hours worth of drugs, or 3 hours worth of drugs. How about the fact that we know that one single use of cocaine can cause a heart attack, as it did for Len Bias, the basketball star who was drafted by the Boston Celtics. He died right out, one single use of cocaine. He was a healthy man, especially now when we're learning about cocaine and how it interrupts blood flow to the heart. Are you going to give people enough drugs to let them kill themselves? If they kill themselves, is the state going to be responsible? Who's going to be held responsible when they do that? Are you going to allow pregnant women to get drugs in these state-supported crack houses or drug dens? Because we know what the effects are on the fetus of the drugs. We know that a single use of cocaine can stroke a fetus, can break the placenta open, and they can bleed to death in the womb. We're going to allow pregnant women to have it? At what age are we going to stop people from going in? Is it going to be 14, 16, 18, 21? For those people who you don't allow into your state-supported crack houses or legalized drug dens, where can they go? They'll go to a black market. The black market will still exist for the youth, for pregnant women, for those people who you don't allow to have any more than their ration. I think it's complete folly. And I think if we as political people, I'm not just a drug counselor, I'm still wearing a political hat, we should understand that this is basically has an agenda. It's part of the final solution to the underclass.
The legalization.
The legalization. Keep them under a chemical yoke for the rest of their natural lives, and those lives will be much shorter. And by the way, when you talk about crime will go down, having grown up as a child of an alcoholic, I know that the kind of devastation that a person under the influence can do to children, unto the loved ones around them. What do you think these people who are getting high at crack, at state-supported crack houses, what are they going to do when they go home to their families and loved ones? Can you imagine what life is going to be like driving in cars? It's bad enough that 50,000 people get killed on the highways from drunks. What is life going to be like when you know that the guy who's driving alongside of you in the next lane has just come out of a crack house? I think life will be much more explosive, much more dangerous, much worse. I don't want to see people have freer, much more accessible, hassle-free drugs. I think we just need to be dealing with root causes, and legalization doesn't deal with root causes. Legalization just deals with the symptom. They want drugs, we'll give them more drugs. Just leave us alone. If you want to kill yourself, go right ahead. It's none of our business.
But criminalization hasn't worked either, as we've seen. Plus, as we talked about at the very first of the program a long time ago, Homo sapien and other animals have used psychoactive substances ever since they've been in existence. So you have a contradiction here, do you not, about how are you going to prohibit, on one hand, criminalize something which seems to be inherent in the human species, the desire for some type of psychoactive experience.
The desire, I think, that human beings have is a desire for pleasure, a desire for belonging, a desire for meaning and purpose in their life, a desire to be connected to other human beings in a meaningful way, a desire to maybe have an out-of-mind experience. Yes, to experience pleasure and excitement. Sure, these folks are tense, but we have other means for people to reduce tension. There's meditation, there's all kinds of, there's massage, there's relaxation devices. We can be teaching people, or we can be building into the culture means other than chemical to help people deal with their emotional problems. I don't think that, yes, criminalization hasn't worked. That's one of the strongest pieces of those who argue for legalization, is that criminalization doesn't work. I'm absolutely in agreement it doesn't work. But legalization would only make things worse.
Jack, what about making a distinction between those drugs that are known to be destructive and harmful? Yes. And let us say cocaine. The latest surveys on cocaine do indicate they can bring heart attacks about. Yes. Crack, we know, is addictive and destructive, which is a cocaine derivative. Can we isolate as a society what drugs are definitely harmful and destructive? Let us say cocaine, heroin, crack, etc.
Alcohol.
Alcohol is a seriously destructive.
Well, I guess what you're left with, I mean, listen, what you're left with is one of the problems with legalization. One of the problems is with legalization is that you literally might be able to technically legalize heroin, because a heroin addict might get off 2 or 3 times a day, but a cocaine addict gets off 6 times an hour.
But is this a solution? Legalize marijuana, legalize even heroin and some of these other new chemicals, these synthetics, that maybe aren't destructive in the same way that crack, cocaine, etc. are. So you provide some pleasurable, anxiety-reducing experiences for people.
Well, we do prescribe drugs in our society. I mean, doctors prescribe drugs. I mean, pharmaceutical houses are the biggest pushers of drugs in the United States. I mean, we have a commercial that says, for Nuprin, I think it says, when you haven't got time for the pain.
Well, is marijuana any, say, more destructive than alcohol, tobacco, or Valium, or some of the chemical drugs that are sold over the counter? For one example.
Well, for one example, it's clear that the people that I know who use marijuana habitually, that they definitely have memory loss. They definitely have short-term memory loss. And
what'd you say?
Now you're up to your old tricks, Frank. So is memory lost? They believe there's issues of sterility. They think there may be changes in, I hypothesize that there may be change in the genetic structure from marijuana. I think the jury is still out about using marijuana. If I had to rank order in terms of danger, no, marijuana doesn't rank in. In fact, when I go out into the high schools, I can't tell the kids that all drugs are harmful, all drugs are destructive. I think I'm doing a disservice. I have to make distinctions that if they're going to use drugs, there are some drugs that are a lot worse than others. There are some drugs that are a lot more destructive than others.
But in terms of legalization, you're not willing to say that any of the drug laws should be changed. You see it more as a societal problem of getting into the sources, the causes of what leads people to
I think you're only feeding the habit. You're not really getting to the source. And by the way, we're interested as radicals in politicizing people, in getting them active, in being involved in their community. I can tell you from personal experience that drugs is not an empowering. It cripples people. Drugs does not build community, it destroys community. Drugs is not something that we as people who are thinking about broader political change should be advocating, because all it really serves to do is basically narcotize people and seduce them into accepting the way that things are as they are.
Do you think that we should recriminalize the use of alcohol and make the use of tobacco products illegal?
Listen, if I had my druthers, people wouldn't drink. But see, I'd have to make a distinction. There are obviously people who can integrate alcohol, a couple of drinks or so, into their life, and it does not have destructive, negative consequences.
Well, you could say the same thing about taking a couple of puffs of marijuana or maybe a snort of cocaine.
Well, I suppose you can, and in fact, there are people who use cocaine that way. The profile of person that I laid out to you, people who come from highly dysfunctional families, who really never get to feel good except when they use chemicals, those people are very vulnerable. I mean, if you're talking about people who in their life have assets to fall back on, I don't mean just financial assets, but they have supportive family, loving friends, they have a decent job, they have a nice place to live. Sure, they may, in fact, I guess it's technically possible, they could have drugs, they could integrate it into their lives. It's something they might do once in a while recreationally. But if you have people who have nothing else to look forward in their life except drugs as a means to feel good, to feel better, at least temporarily, that's a powerful, seductive idea, isn't it?
And yet, as laws now, and the way they're using these laws, they want to throw all of these people into prison. Both groups, the casual user, they're not doing harm to themselves.
I don't think they've won that war. I mean, I've been very observant of the policy-making, drug-making policy in the last few years. There has been a right-wing agenda, basically to use drugs for pretty much locking up about a third of the population. I think if some of these guys had their way. They were talking about, for a while, shooting down planes that they suspected of carrying drugs, drug smuggling. They were talking about locking up first-time users. They were talking about the death penalty for pushers, making no distinction between most users are oftentimes dealers if the only way to cut down on their overhead. They were talking about throwing families of users out of federal housing. In other words, you might be a mother raising 6 kids and your teenage son sells drugs and is caught. The whole family gets thrown out of federal housing. That was Jack Kemp's idea. Well, that didn't go through the Congress. You know, we shouldn't be sort of clumsy about the way we talk about politics in Washington. There are people in Washington who are fighting a civil libertarian position, who are basically trying to see drugs in a broader context, are trying to get treatment for addicts, are trying to deal with this on a more preventive basis. I think so far they've been able to fight off this right-wing agenda, which is quite anti-civil libertarian in its import.
But some of the people pushing these obnoxious proposals are people like George Bush and William Bennett, who are 2 of the highest authorities in this country in the so-called war on drugs. So we have to be very vigilant of what their latest program is going to be. We haven't even mentioned this drug testing, that there's been a lot of trial balloons about testing anyone who has a federal job. Ed Meese, when he was Attorney General, was telling employers they should give drug tests to all their employees. Anyone that doesn't pass is fired. They should have checks in the locker rooms, in the parking lots, etc. So there's very serious attempts to carry out a war on drugs that'll be a war on civil liberties in this country by the right wing. So far, the liberals have more or less kept most of these extreme right-wing projects.
Well, there's also liberals, but there's also
law.
There's also one shouldn't forget. There's also conservatives who have fears of a strong Big Brother state. So there's an alliance among liberals and conservatives in its traditional sense about not wanting to see the growth of state power as a check on this unleashed anti-civil libertarian fervor.
But there's also liberals who go along with conservatives on some of their social programs.
Yes.
And if the war on drugs becomes hysterical, if there's some major murders, let us say, through drug abuse, etc., it's conceivable Congress could pass some extremely repressive drug laws. So I think this is a very dangerous and very tense issue for this country. And until we do come with more humane and more rational perspectives on the whole drug problem, this could easily be something that conservative or even liberal politicians could manipulate in very pernicious ways.
Well, the interesting thing about it is it's clear from watching the circus for several years now, is that drugs are a political football. I mean, it's a very it's a winner of an issue as a politician to run on. After all, who is overtly going to come out and say, I'm for drugs?
You can't be soft on drugs, just like you couldn't be soft on communism.
So really, they really have no, there's no cost to being a drug warrior. But in the same time it's been a political football, I think that the discussion, the way the terms of the debate have been framed, have depoliticized the issue. By only talking about a war on drugs, the public discussion has been over the tactics of the war. Should we go down to Colombia? Should we extradite the leaders? Should we destroy the crops? Should we lock up users? Should we be executing pushers? Should we be throwing people out of federal housing? Should we have mandatory testing? But this emphasis on tactic has obscured a much more fundamental examination, a much more introspective approach that would look at what are the underlying assumptions of the war. And basically both the Democratic and Republican parties have been war parties in this matter. They both have been advocating a much more stringent attack on drugs than looking at it in a much more holistic and larger contextual understanding. They really have not been for that. And that's essentially what we need. And we're not getting that kind of discussion from either of the major parties.
If you could have the beat officer 40 with me for an attempt warrant service.
8401 Olive Street in East Oakland has been busted so many times, the police know people there by their first names.
Travis is the one I'm looking for. Travis is at school? Yeah. And Fred is where?
In an otherwise well-kept neighborhood, the mess at the corner stands out. The electricity's been turned off, there's no heat, and the trouble has spilled over to 2 adjacent houses.
That's got a leaky sewer under there, that's why it's so messy. They're using them for smoke houses.
There have been 17 arrests here in 9 months, 16 of them for drugs. In spite of this, neighbors admit the drug business hasn't stopped. All the arrests haven't worked, so now the police and the Oakland City Attorney have a court order to stop the drugs. Believe it or not, it might be a better threat. It certainly carries a higher price tag.
They don't stop, then it's contempt of court. Then we take the house, we seize it, we seize everything inside of it, we board it up, we don't allow it to be used for a full year, plus we fine them $25,000.
Police this week are looking for the building's owner, Freddie Mayo, to serve him with the order. Today they found only relatives.
Hey, I said don't film me.
A year from now, officers said they expect 8401 Olive to have a family living in it, one with a legal income. In East Oakland, Tom DeVries, News Center 4.
This is the Perry School on Pennsylvania Avenue in Richmond. Small children at innocent play less than 2 blocks from one of the city's busiest drug-dealing corners, 7th and Pennsylvania. Mayor George Livingston says that is too close.
It's like a cancer, but eventually we're going to capture it. We can only do so much in the city of Richmond, but you can bet your sweet lips we're going to kick their butts.
Tonight in these chambers, the mayor and city council will consider an ordinance to make Richmond schools drug-free zones. Anyone caught selling drugs within 1,000 feet of a school could face double the normal penalty. And Lieutenant Ray Howard says this law would also affect buyers.
If you're coming into one of these drug-free zones to buy drugs, and we get a chance to, we're going to take your car, we're going to take personal property. It makes it very difficult for the demand and the supply side to operate.
The plan was conceived with the help and blessing of Dr. Walter Marks, the superintendent of schools.
We always worry the minute you have people dealing drugs and selling them, what else that might result in, as far as guns are concerned and fights and that type of thing.
The plan gets mixed reactions from students.
You think the drug dealers are going to stay away, or are they still going to hang around?
No, they'll still hang around. They probably won't hang around as much.
A similar law is in effect in New Jersey. In its first year, 6,500 dealers got extra jail time. And officials there say they are seeing fewer and fewer drug deals going down around schools. In Richmond, I'm John Fulmer, News Center 4.
And that they will be punished. Bennett said the certainty of punishment for users and dealers is more important than the severity. NBC's Lisa Myers covers the drug beat for us, and tonight she describes on how some areas are using this new approach.
In March, Phoenix area police declared war on drug users.
If you choose to use illegal drugs in Phoenix, you will be held accountable.
Since then, about 125 users have been arrested every week. Yuppies, lawyers, construction workers. All must spend at least one night in jail. Then those with no criminal record have a choice.
We'll prosecute and go forward in a very strong manner. Or secondly, we're going to offer them an opportunity to get into a diversion program and to change their lifestyle and their drug usage.
Those who choose to try to change their ways agree to counseling, community service, and frequent drug tests. And they must pay for it all themselves. The cost depends on the drug involved, from $685 for marijuana to $2,845 for cocaine. Bennett today called for more programs like this one to teach Americans that casual drug use is not a matter of personal preference.
It has costs, wide, horrible social costs. The suburban man who drives his BMW downtown to buy cocaine is killing himself, of course, but he's also killing the city he drives into at the same time.
Bennett praised a Philadelphia program under which people who drive their BMWs to buy drugs lose their cars for good. Bennett says he also likes revoking the driver's licenses of teenage drug users and holding parents accountable for the actions of their children. He says he's concluded that certainty of punishment is more important than severity of punishment.
Those guilty of drug offenses must believe that punishment is inevitable.
Experts estimate that more than half of the 23 million Americans who use drugs are casual users who can change their behavior given enough incentives. Bennett believes going after them is the fastest way to reduce demand for drugs.
News Center 4 learned last night that the troops had begun to move south in convoy. Bob Sirkin is awaiting their arrival now at the Port of Los Angeles, and he joins us now with the first of two reports. Bob?
Sylvia, this call-up of National Guardsmen is taking place in 11 other states, including California, but never before has the California National Guard been pressed into this type of service on this scale. Their mission primarily to come to major ports such as Los Angeles and assist U.S. Customs officers in searching containerized freight for illegal drugs. News Center 4 has learned the call-up involves at least 3 major National Guard units of the 3rd Brigade, one of them from San Jose. Reportedly, several hundred guardsmen, all volunteering for the drug war, are en route tonight to the Los Alamitos Armed Forces Reserve Center in Orange County. There, the guardsmen will get a crash course in finding concealed drugs. San Jose Guard Captain Frank Lemus.
These soldiers would be used to train in their specific military specialties, and it's an opportunity for them to get some hands-on or field-type environment training, something that they would get above and beyond their normal training that we would do at Camp Roberts.
Once trained, the guardsmen will be under the direct control of U.S. Customs. Most will be used in search operations at California's major ports, especially Los Angeles, where 1.5 million freight containers arrive each year, many of them carrying huge quantities of smuggled drugs. Last year, U.S. Customs officials at the Port of Oakland showed us how smugglers conceal drugs beneath container floors and in hollow door and ceiling frames. Agents drill through suspect containers, often dismantling them looking for drugs. But actually finding the stuff, such as Thai hashish found here hidden in cotton bales, is like looking for a needle in a haystack. U.S. Customs, plagued with manpower and budgetary problems, simply cannot search every container arriving from the Golden Triangle area of Asia. That's why the National Guardsmen are needed. National Guard Major Steve Mensek says this is more than just a weekend drill.
We will be involved approximately a month in a rather extensive operation, and we have other operations that will be going on clear in through the end of September.
A high-ranking U.S. Customs official told me today that he considers this whole guard call-up a joke, saying that these guardsmen have no real training, no equipment, and no arrest powers at all. Searching containerized freight will not be the only mission these guardsmen will get involved in fighting the drug war. We have more on that now from Joe Benton in Washington.
Bob, News Center 4 sources here in Washington say the California National Guard will set up and operate radar along the Mexican border, that they will help out with surveillance, for instance, staking out airfields that drug agents suspect drug smugglers are using. And eventually, the California National Guard will fly missions along the U.S.-Mexican border, searching for aircraft suspected of smuggling drugs into the state. A Capitol Hill source said today that drug enforcement officials want the sophisticated Apache attack helicopter to patrol the U.S.-Mexican border in search of drug smugglers. The Apache is loaded with sensitive infrared and electronic detection equipment and can be heavily armed. None of the helicopters, however, are assigned to the California National Guard and would have to be supplied from other units around the country. Customs officials in Los Angeles would neither confirm nor deny the request for the high-tech military helicopters. At the Pentagon, a spokesman for the National Guard said it is unlikely that helicopters flying support missions for drug enforcement agencies would be armed, though crew members might carry sidearms depending on the nature of their mission.
The National Guardsmen are not going to be on the street patrolling as policemen. They are not arresting anybody. They are not out there seizing contraband. We are supporting law enforcement, enhancing their ability to do those types of missions.
California Republican Pete Wilson led the fight in Congress to involve the National Guard in the drug war. Wilson confirmed that Guard units will monitor the U.S. border with Mexico.
I think that rather than having them simply fly paper missions, they can fly some real missions and deal with what, in fact, is a far more serious threat to our national security, to our national welfare, far more immediate than any military threat.
So the plan, at least on paper, calls for the California National Guard to offer wide-ranging support to federal agents chasing drug smugglers. But if any shooting begins, to stay out of harm's way.
Sa's face has never made the cover of Time. Most of us had never heard his name. But what he sells flows in the veins of most of America's junkies. He is the world's biggest drug dealer. And News Center 4's Gary Rebstock went to Burma to get his story. Gary?
Sylvia, in one of the poorest valleys in Burma lives a man named Khun Sa, and he is a multi-millionaire. But like the beautiful red poppies that grow in his fields, Khun Sa is not what he appears. He is a father whose trade kills children, a monarch who cries freedom, a drug dealer who builds schools, a man who holds much of America captive.
In my opinion, Khun Sa is obviously one of the most notorious drug traffickers in the history of the world.
The general would be a hero to you?
Yes, not only for me, for the Shan peoples.
In the United States, I would rank him as public enemy #1.
I think he is freedom fighters.
Khun Sa and his group had laid on an assassination attempt of our group, either an assassination or a kidnapping.
Who is this man with the haunting laugh, who's accused of trying to kill a U.S. congressman, who's considered a hero by his people, who has his own private army? who travels his land in a white pickup truck with 6 armed guards in the back, and whom you've probably never heard of. And how did he come to be the world's biggest drug dealer? That's what we went to find out. Khun Sa lives in what is called the black area of Burma, the Shan state, called black because it is not controlled by the Burmese government. It lies south of China and west of Laos and Thailand. To reach Khun Sa's Homong compound, you enter the Shan state illegally from Thailand. From the border, it is a 12-hour trip by mule and on foot, through dense jungles and thick forests. The Shan state is a mountainous region. It is one of the most beautiful places on earth, and also one of the poorest. Life has changed little for most people here in the last 100 years, but the Shan state is the perfect place to grow opium poppies.
They
That is how Khun Sa justifies his business to the outside world. But for the support of his people, he appeals to their patriotism. Each morning, Khun Sa's soldiers sing the Shan national anthem, an anthem for a nation that does not exist. The Shans were promised their independence 30 years ago by the Burmese, but have never received it. For Khun Sa's soldiers, his history makes him the perfect role model. Khun Sa was 13 when World War II ended, the same age many of his soldiers start training today. Their future is his past. He has been fighting all his life, but not always for Shan independence. Lester Wolf chaired the House Narcotics Committee in the 1970s. He investigated Khun Sa.
I was told that he was one of the principal traffickers in the region, that he had some connection with their independence movement, but primarily he was a businessman. In other words, a hired gun.
A hired gun at one point for the people he was supposed to be fighting. In 1963, at the age of 30, the Burmese government made Khun Sa a militia commander in the Shan state. He was not paid. He was allowed to traffic in small amounts of opium to support his army. His future was decided. Khun Sa soon broke with the Burmese, but not the opium trade. It was far too lucrative. The farmers who grow the opium are paid very little for their labor, perhaps a few $100s for their entire crop. But usually they are given salt or clothing for their opium, not cash. Khun Sa's agents buy the raw opium and then boil it carefully in makeshift jungle laboratories, the first step in turning opium into morphine or heroin. That refined opium is then loaded on horses and mules and makes its way to the border of Thailand, always under the protection of Khun Sa's army. Khun Sa charges $300,000 a ton for opium upon delivery to dealers in Thailand, and he delivers a lot of it. It has been said that
you control as little as 30% or as much as 90% of all the opium that is grown in the Shan state. What is the true amount?
80%.
80%.
80% of the Shan state's opium production is roughly 1,000 tons of opium a year. At $300,000 a ton, that's $300 million for Khun Sa. $300 million for delivering opium to Thailand, where it is refined into heroin and shipped all over the world, where its value skyrockets. On the streets of Tokyo, Paris, New York, or San Francisco, the heroin Khun Sa supplies will bring more than $200 billion, and much of it comes to America. February 1989, the DEA and FBI announced the world's largest heroin bust ever, with arrests in San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles. 800 pounds of pure heroin, worth more than $1 billion. smuggled in tires. It came from Southeast Asia. It came from Khun Sa. Robert Bender is Assistant Special Agent in charge of the San Francisco Office of the Drug Enforcement Administration. He spent 3 years as a field agent in Southeast Asia. In terms of what he supplies every year,
it's a mere drop in the bucket.
World's biggest heroin bust ever, and it's a drop in the bucket
to him.
It was drug money that built this compound where Khun Sa trains his soldiers. A compound that is growing every day. And it is drug money that allows Khun Sa to live like what he is, the king of heroin. This is one of Khun Sa's houses. He has 4 of them here at the compound, though we're told he seldom stays here. Sometimes he stays with villagers, sometimes with his soldiers. But Khun Sa's main home is about a half-mile from here, at a place called The Garden. A private lake with a gazebo is the first thing you see at Khun Sa's garden. There will be 2 swimming pools here. Both will be lined with tile. In a country with no electricity, he has brought in a generator and power tools from Thailand to build his newest home here. It will be made of brick, also imported. He likes his food fresh, so they are raising turkey and quail here. Also geese, ducks, and rabbit. And of course, there is a fish farm. And soon, an aviary for his exotic birds. This is Khun Sa's version of paradise. Not bad for a man with a price on his head. This is a wanted poster. Under pressure from the United States, the Thai government is offering 500,000 baht for Khun Sa, dead or alive. That's about $20,000 in a land where a soldier's pay is 20 cents a day. Some of Khun Sa's competitors would pay much more. Which is why, wherever Khun Sa goes, even to his own army's annual soccer tournament, there are always lots of armed guards around. Even the man who serves Khun Sa's tea carries a loaded .45. If history has taught us anything, it is that anyone can be assassinated, no matter how many security guards they have, no matter how large their army.
But he offers his protectors something that money can't buy. Gary?
Sylvia, in the Shan state of Burma, where Khun Sa lives and works, the people live lives of utter poverty. They are oppressed brutally by the Burmese government. Khun Sa offers them hope, offers dreams of a better life, of liberty from their oppressors, of happiness. The price of hope is heroin. Khun Sa calls himself the George Washington of his people, and many of them revere him as a patriarch, to be loved and protected. The opening ceremony for the annual soccer tournament of Khun Sa's Shan United Army. A ceremony they practiced to get right before the boss arrived, General Khun Sa. These are the same men who will protect Khun Sa's opium shipments, but that was not the subject of his opening speech. The general tells them of a village in the northern Shan state that he's just learned was attacked and burned to the ground by the army of the Burmese Communist Party, his competitors in the opium trade, though that is not mentioned. The perfect fatherly tone coming from the world's biggest drug dealer. But that is not how his people see him. Do you wish to be like him?
Yes, I wish. I came here to be a soldier, to be a Shan freedom fighter.
Until 6 months ago, Saipan Mong was a student at Rangoon University. One of the students demonstrating in the streets last summer calling for a new and democratic government in Burma. One of the students fired upon by the Burmese army. He showed us the identity card all non-Burmese must carry in Burma. It identifies him as a Shan, which means he can never get a good job or get a passport. He thinks Khun Sa will change all that for the Shan people.
Because he left Shan peoples to fight for the Shan people what they need, what they want, and their freedoms.
Have you read that others have accused him of being a drug dealer?
I have heard, but I have no seen by my eyes.
Nor will he. Not here at Khun Sa's compound. Not here in Khun Sa's valley. What he will see is the school that Khun Sa's drug money has built. A school for the villagers' children, where they learn a discipline and respect that would be the envy of any American teacher. And he will see the hospital Khun Sa's drug money pays for, where the young boys in Khun Sa's Boys Brigade line up each morning to get pills for a stomachache or antibiotics for the flu, where a village man can get an injection for an intestinal problem, and all of it free of charge, and where Dr. Bury, also a refugee from the capital of Burma, treats Khun Sa's soldiers wounded in battle.
This one wounded by bullet, and the femur is broken.
As a doctor, how do you feel about the fact that everything here is financed through the opium trade?
You know, I didn't interest in the opium trade. It's not my job, so I didn't interest on it.
The doctor, like the soldier, suffers from a common syndrome here: see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. They think only of the fight for freedom from Burma. They see only the good Khun Sa's drug money does for the Shan people. And some of them owe their lives to Khun Sa, like Rong Kiao, a refugee from an area controlled by the Burmese government.
อันแรกกว่าเฮ็ดปอดตาเนี่ยเขาเอาทิ้งไว้ค่ะนะเพราะว่านาซิกเนี่ยเขากูก้นลักไปเนี่ยเขามัดต้อยกันเขาบางปอก็อันเมื่อหับปอดตานั่นเขาก็ไม่ได้กินอิ่มค่ะเฮ็ดไหนเขาทำเฮ็ดคืออันเขามัดเขาขาดต้อยกันเนี่ยเขาทำกูปากกระป้ายยื้อเขานั่นค่ะก็
Kiao escaped with his family and 12 other families from his village. It took them 3 years to make their way to Khun Sa's valley. They had nothing when they arrived, but Khun Sa gave them land and the tools to work it. He gave them enough rice and money for a year, and more than that, he gave them hope.
มาอยู่กันแล้วเขาได้อยู่ดีนอนดีแต่เลยกึดลองอันคำใจสิเจ้าเสียเมียเนี่ยมันมีสังขารเป็นจังได๋ครับเขาขาดได้อ่านอยู่ในตัวจูแล้ว
Try to convince Rong Kiao that his benefactor is public enemy number 1.
เข้ามาเดียวเป็นกุนจางกุนเมืองว่ะกุนเมืองเขาจะเอาตึกไปอย่างสูเอาเมืองบ้านเขาว่ะ
Khun Sa, the drug dealer with an answer for every question, even for the devastation his heroin brings. What do you say to an American mother whose child has died from a heroin overdose or from AIDS, from infected needles when shooting heroin? What would you say to that mother?
อันไหนเนี่ยเขากินยาเขาอิลูเขาเคยอูเมเขาละตัวอัจยาเขามาหาคนสาธุตนมันเขามีเงินก็อย่าไปสั่งซื้อยาผิดได้อันนี้เป็นที่หนึ่งยาเก่าเนี่ยอิลูอันจะตายกว่ามกาไม่ใจจอมอันมีอยู่ในปุ่มสุรา
He has been called the Prince of Darkness, and by the devil we are being offered a deal. Khun Sa has made millions of dollars from the heroin trade, and now he desperately wants to become legitimate. He wants to be recognized by the United States, by any Western power, as the savior of his people, not the world's most wanted criminal. So Khun Sa is offering to quit the drug business, to eradicate half the world's heroin supply, for a price. It is Thursday morning, April 6th. Khun Sa arrives on time for our 9 o'clock interview. You have a very beautiful compound. His security force arrived about 15 minutes earlier. Even though this is his compound, the base camp of his 10,000-man army, Khun Sa doesn't take any chances. Seated beneath pictures of the King and Queen of Thailand, a country that has placed a price on his head, Khun Sa, the opium king with the haunting laugh, told us of his plan to get his people out of the opium and heroin business forever.
eng kla mung che pen mi atoya pen pi la ya mi mung tai ne mi atoya lo ho pim la po khe ya phin hai mung tai lo mi atoya hai ho ne ho bi zai su thui mo ra na mới ho la ne 70 che la ma liu 80 cao pon ma lai pi yao tham ya phin khao rong hai hai ru pai nam ma wan.
This is Khun Sa's 6-year plan for ending opium production in the Shan State. It calls for bringing in agricultural specialists to help his farmers grow other crops, and medical specialists to teach them the evil their opium brings to the world, building roads and bridges to get their new crops to market, schools to educate their children, and hospitals to provide medical care. In exchange, Khun Sa will deliver an increasing percentage of his opium to authorities and decrease the amount that is grown until it's all gone at the end of 6 years. The price tag to the United States government is $288 million to be paid over 6 years.
And Khun Sa will allow American observers to come in and check the opium production and be involved in every step of the eradication program?
Nè, hao thằng à, nó à chỗ yam khai pi, mi ăn khai pi ya pin này, nè lô cả mi kun song ko, ăn lu lan khao su mới xì đang Khun Sa.
An absurd statement coming from the world's biggest heroin supplier, but he's been making the offer for at least 12 years.
Mà bị dính cao bảo chế sĩ chế khu Mr. Wolf, giờ Joseph mà, họว่าhọ bị, họจะถุยหักสูเฮียนได้เจ็บไปมันก็ป่งขึ้นนะเมื่อเขาล้านได้70เจ็ดมาเร็ว80เก่าปนมาหลายปีแล้วทำด้วยอย่าพิงเขาลองหายหายรู้ไปหนำมาวัน
But in 1977, the House Select Committee on Narcotics did recommend making a deal with Khun Sa in this report, a deal called a preemptive buy. The reason the committee cited is this: what we have done in the past has not been effective. The report goes on to conclude the answer is not helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft to transport troops. We have to reach some sort of agreement with the people who are growing opium. Lester Wolf chaired the House Narcotics Committee in 1977. Their recommendation was rejected by the Carter White House.
We were told that this was against policy, and yet prior to that time in 1972, the United States government paid $1 million to some group for 26 tons of opium. We also, subsequent to that, paid the Turkish government not to plant opium. This was, in effect, a preemptive buy as well.
Instead, Washington opted for more helicopters and more troops. This is videotape taken by the Thai military of its assault on Khun Sa's compound in northern Thailand in January 1982. It had been his base of operations, unmolested, for 5 years, until pressure from the U.S. became too great. Weapons and supplies were seized in this raid, but not Khun Sa. A week before, he had moved across the border into Burma, where he travels his land with his security force, where his new compound is 10 times as large, and the so-called war against him and his army is even less effective. The countries that are supposed to be fighting Khun Sa run articles like this one in the Bangkok Post on Friday, April 7th. It says the Border Patrol Police and Khun Sa's men are poised to do battle. But on that date, Khun Sa's frontline forces were busy smoking venison from a deer they killed and erecting a new headquarters building, not preparing for battle. The simple fact is, Khun Sa has built a kingdom for himself, and his drug money makes him untouchable. As distasteful as it is, Khun Sa's offer may be the only hope for stopping the flow of his heroin. While Western governments continue to reject it, Khun Sa keeps on laughing, all the way to the bank. We asked drug czar William Bennett to respond to Khun Sa's offer. He said that he is just beginning to study Asian narcotics matters, that he has until September 5th to formulate his national drug strategy, that for now, he has no comment. Bob, Sylvia?
This could be a screenplay.
Yeah, many.
In the main line of the drug problem in America, people with solutions. Tonight, we hear from the Reverend David Perrin, a former gang member in his youth whose own life was turned around following the violent gang-related death of his best friend. Recently, Reverend Perrin was asked to preach the funeral of Daryl Murchison, a drug-dealing member of one of Washington, D.C.'s most murderous street gangs. The 23-year-old Murchison's violent death from 2 shotgun blasts was a front-page story in the Washington Post. On the op-ed page of the Post, Reverend Perrin mused about death and young men. He said most of us as young people really felt that we couldn't die, even though I saw people all around me dying. I can think of 5 times in my own community situation that I've had a gun to my head and just looked right down the barrel at death. And so when I was saying to those brothers at the funeral that it's your lifestyle that's killing you, and if you continue to maintain that kind of lifestyle, that you are going to die. I asked Reverend Perrin to tell me more about why he decided to preach at that funeral.
Daryl Murchison, for whatever his sins were, his problems were, his mistakes in life, still nevertheless, that's a service. It's a last act of kindness and so forth as a minister that's given to the family, friends. It certainly was an opportunity, my knowing what was involved and my own background, to be able to say, hey, if I can minister to these young people and God has given me this particular opportunity, then Daryl's death still may not be let's say, totally in vain. That indeed maybe somebody as a result of his death might say, I need to turn my life around. I need to go in a different direction. I'm very close to death myself, and I need to do something about that. So it was a chance. It was an opportunity.
You said that many of the young dealers out there on the street are themselves victims. What did you mean by that?
Well, I look at the drug industry as being perhaps capitalism's cancer. We have to understand we're talking business. We're talking about a product, and that product is drugs, and that product is marketed on the U.S. streets. So when we come to want to understand how we're going to stop it or how we're going to deal with it, we first of all, like many people do talk of it, as a business. Now, in a business sense, first of all, it requires, for the first initial purchase and the importing, it requires a certain amount of capital to be able to do that. And that's a major kind of investment. Wherever we're importing it from, that takes an initial investment of capital, and somebody has to put that up. Now, as that's put up and it keeps being broken down on various levels and then finally hits the streets, the person at which it hits the street level, that's the little brothers who are living in our neighborhoods and our communities. They have not been involved in the major higher levels of the drug industry in our country. The drug industry, like any other industry, needs a group of marketers. It needs a group of salesmen and saleswomen. Who does it get that from? Well, it gets it from brothers and sisters who are anxious and greedy to be able to have the things that the American dream promises. And so they take the highest amount of risk. So what we're seeing is that the people who are actually dying, people who are actually being killed in great numbers, once again, are young black men who are being exploited because the importers, they want the investment, they want the high return and the yield, but they don't want to be the person who's going door to door or flagging cars down or holding their head out of an apartment building to say, hey, yeah, here, you can get a $20 bag or so forth. And I guess that's the point I would make even stronger for today, that when we ourselves support the drug industry in any way, we ourselves as a race are involved in self-genocide. We are involved in the systematic elimination of our children and of our future and of our legacy ourselves, and we're perpetuating that upon ourselves.
How do you turn all that around?
Well, what we've done here as a fellowship and as a church is to say, and when we analyze it, money plays a very big role in the drug industry on every side, also in terms of rehabilitation. That if I don't have money, then I cannot buy, or that people need to become productive again in the use of their money. Now, that's done in several ways in several different programs. One of them that we're working on right now is just where, through a bonded service through our church, you would be able to sign over your monthly check, and what would happen, we would establish goals for you as a person, your goals that you want to achieve, and then help you to save some money, help you to put aside some money, help you to move from one environment to another environment. That's number one. Number two is friends and associates, that in this cycle that's involved in breaking the drug cycle, not only do you have to turn around and use your money productively, you've got to change your cycle of friends. Most people do drugs with somebody. They don't do them alone. There's a buddy kind of system. So what we have to do is to analyze, and we try to help people to analyze, who do you associate with? Break that cycle and begin to pair people up with people in the church who are non-drug users, who will become a partner to that person that is using drugs and begin to help them and monitor the signs of when they're going back in that direction. The third thing we found is that all of the paraphernalia and everything in this environment is conducive to drugs. It is reminiscence of drugs and so forth. The environment has other drug crack houses and people and dealers and so forth. So we need to get people out of those environments. That is done through, again, like across the street with the apartment building. We said, hey, can we set up where you would give us an apartment building? And in that apartment building, we would be able to set up a, so to speak, center, not in the sense of the classical sense of the drug centers, but housing for people who are now off of drugs, living with a buddy, a Christian person who's in that home with that person, with one apartment in that building designated specifically for training, where that person would come, receive an education, get some information, support group meetings, and so forth. Finally, we have to do everything that we can to stop the pushers, to actually cut off the supply. And that goes all the way from the importing to help the government, to support the government, to support the laws, to deal with pinpointing people in the community who are pushing drugs. In our church, you can phone in and say, hey, I know of a crack house that's in our community. And from that, we work then with the authorities and with the apartment complex to say, we pinpointed another crack house that's in the community that's working through your apartment complex. We want to work with the local police and so forth. And that's done so that the member or the person involved doesn't have to say, I personally did that. But they're able to call our church. And as a result, we then make a contact within the community to say, let's stop it.
Somebody wrote an article recently saying that what was missing here was the visible will of the people rising up, saying we're not going to tolerate this. How important is that?
I think that's very important. I think that we've reached a point where if the drug problem is going to be stopped in our community, it's going to take a reordering of our values, of everybody's values. The single parenting issue works hard against us because with so many mothers who are doing everything that they can, they don't have husbands in the family and so forth, that creates an environment in which drugs can grow and fester and so forth. But irregardless of that, all of the churches, all of the law enforcement agencies, the news medias, everything, I think that all of us are going to have to say no, but no through action, no through getting involved, taking some time, working with our children, becoming involved in the school systems and so forth to be able to bring this whole thing to an end and turn it around.
What do you think William Bennett should do?
When I look back at what I'd like to see us do as a nation, okay, I would say, if I can just reminisce a little bit, before the breakup of my mother and father's marriage, right back in the early 60s there, I remember a community where there were strong social service agencies for young people. A place that young people came and received role models, played basketball, learned skills, crafts, tap dancing, things of that nature. And the people that staffed that, I remember all of them as being beautiful, strong, black people. And I remember that they had a great impression upon me and my life and my family and my brothers and sisters. And I remember banquets and family meetings that took place there. And then I remember that somewhere, and I was too young to realize the politics of it, we begun to have a series of just cutbacks. And most of those kind of programs in my own community, it seemed like they vanished. They just disappeared. And I'm not talking about welfare programs. I'm talking about the kind of healthy program that builds young men and young women's lives, provides them with sound role models, provides them with the activities when they come home from school, strong tutoring programs. I remember all of that taking place in my community. And then I remember it being dismantled. I think that one of the things that we've got to come back to is a sense in which, for the young children that are coming up, remember drugs is a product. Therefore, it grows by supply and demand. Where there's no demand, there is no product. The drug dealers, like anybody else, would have to find something else to sell. So that if we can begin with a young generation of children that are coming up to eliminate the drug mentality, to so educate them and expose them and overexpose them to the problems that grow out of drugs, to give them that online experience, even in the prisons, to see where drugs ends up, so that they, in a way, are inoculated, if you will, against the use of drugs. A mentality, a whole different mindset, and then also provide them with wholesome activities within their community to do. I think that we do a lot to turn around the whole situation. And I guess I feel a lot of things in terms of what I remember about black people and their families. I remember the grandmother images and people like that who really cared. And I'm saying that I know that we're a lot more fractured, but I think that churches have to once again say that if you don't have a father in your home, then our church and the men in our church will be a father to your children. And we have to say right out there in the streets, we have to get out there and play basketball and be out there in the community and say, brother, that's not the way.